Very warm welcome to Dorset Humanists again, and just to let you know what's coming up soon, we were hoping to return to Moordown Community Centre on Saturday the 10th of July, in about a month's time. It's looking a little bit doubtful, I think you'll agree. I think we need to wait and see what the Prime Minister says on Monday, but the leaks are not looking too good. So we're going to have to just see what to do about Moordown. But we'll hopefully meet everyone in a real setting as soon as possible. We'll keep you posted. But our next event is tomorrow, which is a spectacular walk in the Tyranny Ranges, across the Tyranny Ranges in Dorset, with wonderful views. So do please join us for some exercise and some company. We're planning 2 walks. We're getting into the idea of having a short walk and a long walk, so that it's more inclusive, and all the details are on our meetup site. So I hope you all are a member of our meetup site. If not, just go to Dorset Humanists, just go to meetup and look for the Dorset Humanists site. We are recording this event this afternoon, so if you don't want to be seen on the recording, especially if you're still eating your lunch, then do please turn off your video. You can turn it back on at any point later on if you would like to. Well, our speakers today are Lucy Thom and David Moon. Lucy is based in Ringwood and David is based in Dorchester. Lucy is a well-being economist, an independent health researcher, a mediator, conflict coach and team facilitator. And David Moon is a retired chartered engineer with a career in manufacturing. They're both active members of a pressure group which you may have heard of called Positive Money. And this is their second talk for Dorset Humanists. They spoke to us about positive money some time ago. But today they're going to be speaking to us about the well-being economy and the tragedy of growth. And we will obviously have time for questions and answers after their presentations. So I'm sure you will all give them a silent, but nevertheless a very warm welcome. So David and Lucy, I'm going to, you can unmute yourselves. I'm going to make sure that you can share screen. And yeah, so I think it will be over to you. Who's going first, by the way? Is it David or Lucy?
I'll be going first, David.
Okay, Lucy.
Yeah, in fact, can people hear me okay, speaking like this?
That seems fine. And do you want to share your screen now, Lucy, or?
No, to be honest, I won't be.
Okay.
I'm happy to share some resources. You know, I could email you some photos that you can put up on your website or share with people who've listened to the talk.
Thank you. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll kick off. Well, first of all, I really would like to say how delighted I am to be here today with you. And David and I have enjoyed exploring this topic together. I'm just going to say that if you do have, although we will have a main question and discussion period at the end, if anybody has a burning question or is really not understanding something, we keep using a term or an acronym, then, you know, I think I would prefer people to interrupt us, and David has said the same. So our outline plan for this talk is that I want to first have a look at what do we actually mean by the well-being economy, what are our views of well-being, and why has it become such a hot topic, not just in the healthcare sector and welfare and so on, but very much in economics as well, which I would say is heartening and perhaps overdue. So that's an encouraging shift. I'll then be handing over to David, who will examine, well, the tragedy of growth, which is the other part of our title. And he will be explaining why positive money has an emphasis on debunking GDP and growth. Then David will hand back to me for part 3, and I will be looking at alternatives to GDP. So if we're going to be dumping gross domestic product as a measure of prosperity, what will take its place? And finally, David will then explore the monetary and financial systems that will be needed to support this totally new way of doing economics, really. So that's the plan. So to kick off, well-being. Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is Abraham Maslow's pyramid of needs, which he came up with back in 1943, and I think has since, well, it's still referred to today by many academics, albeit with some extra categories and so on. But one thing I would like to do, if I may, is invite you to cast your minds back pre-COVID, and assuming that we here are all fortunate enough to have our basic needs met, and I wonder if you might want to type these in the chat as a way of participating, just to get an idea of the variety of activities that people partake in to enhance their well-being. I thought that would be, just quite a useful thing to look at. So, you can just pop them in one word, whether it's walking, swimming, going to concerts. And let's just, David, I don't know if you want to read some of them out. David Warden.
Yes, well, I put gym and piano playing. We've got cycling, walking, music, sunbathing, yoga, meditation, walking, being in nature, socializing, reading in the garden, drinking, playing guitar, eating out, dancing, gardening.
Fantastic.
Music.
So in other words, there's quite a rich variety of activities. And the point I'm keen to make here is that beyond the basic needs that we all have of water, food, shelter, security, those kind of physiological needs, if you will, the needs that we then have in terms of our kind of personal growth are going to vary enormously, because for somebody going out regularly to socialise with lots of people is a must, and to others that would just be dreadfully stressful. So it's interesting, and I think in part of the incredible challenge to economists and policymakers generally, this business of how do you evaluate that? How do you turn those descriptive, qualitative information into data? Because as we know, economists love data and numbers. So we will be looking at that in part 3. But just keep that in mind, that list. So there are various economists who have been raising the question of well-being for some years. I think the great financial crisis of 2007-2008 was quite a wake-up call, and there was a commission that was set up to report on the measurement of economic performance and social progress in 2009, and this was headed by Stiglitz, Sen and Fitoussi, And their big conclusion was that the time is absolutely ripe. Actually, I'd added in absolutely, so I'm quoting. The time is ripe for our measurement system to shift emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being. There's also been recently, 2018, a book called Wellbeing Economics, The Capabilities Approach to Prosperity, by Dalziel, Saunders and Saunders. And it looks like a really promising read, very interesting. But again, there is this hesitation to really challenge the fundamental systems, which I believe we really need to transform if we want to properly impact well-being and improve well-being. Kate Raworth, her book is called Donut Economics, and I think we probably mentioned it in our the last talk that we did 3 years ago. So she doesn't, it's interesting, she doesn't precisely refer to well-being. However, if you remember the donut, she does have this just and safe space for humanity, and all these indicators, which is like a more detailed version of Maslow's 5 needs, and you know, so I think she's been onto it for quite a long time without actually, you know, referring to it specifically. And donut economics is very much known as part of circular economics. So I just would like to say that even if we're not hearing the word well-being, there are many other economists who are very conscious of the need to prioritise well-being, and by which I mean the well-being of the planet as well as people. So in conclusion for this little first bit, what I've hoped to get across to you is, oh, hang on a minute, no, I'm jumping the gun. It's all right, you can breathe a bit longer, David Moon. Why is it being such a hot topic? Okay, so we all know that there was the crash in 2007, 2008, which, as I said, was a wake-up call. I was looking at some recent statistics. So in January 2020, this is for the UK, and we have a population of about 66 million, 4.3 million children are categorised as living beneath the breadline or poverty line. And I think what's really shocking, I mean, that to me is shocking. It gets me actually when I think of that. But what is also, you know, it sort of even compounds it to me, is that 3/4 of those 4.3 million children are actually living in a household with at least one working adult. So in other words, in-work poverty has risen. It was said to be at 67% in 2015, and is and last year, this is pre-COVID, was estimated to be at 75%. Now, on the one hand, you know, there's this business of fundamental needs not being met. The crazy thing, and again, I think also why there's this real drive now to actually prioritise well-being, is that even people who are in, you know, not well above the poverty line, you know, have actually in material terms got ample sufficiency, they are nonetheless suffering huge amounts of stress. So stress, this is a statement from the National Institute for Health in the US. Emotional stress is a major contributing factor to the 6 leading causes of death, which are cancer, coronary heart disease, accidental injuries, respiratory disorders, cirrhosis of the liver, and suicide. So emotional stress is a major contributing factor. And in the UK, the Health and Safety Executive carried out a labour force survey in 2019-2020. So again, this is pre-COVID. And they found that 828,000 workers are suffering from some sort of work-related stress, depression, or anxiety. So for all our apparent wealth that many of us, are comfortably off and so on, there's still an enormous amount of things that people are struggling with. And then, of course, there's the whole question of the environment and how we're using resources and so on. So on that note, I'm now going to hand over to David, who is going to have a look at how we've ended up where we are. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lucy.
Okay, thank you. Well, I will use a share screen, if I may, David.
Yes.
So I go to share screen. It always takes me a moment with this great system. I have to go to advanced setting here, and I'm actually going to click on there. Position on screen, you'll see something pretty peculiar to begin with, but don't worry, when I actually click on my keynote and go to play rehearse slideshow, hopefully you will now all see the front page of the, is that right?
Yes, I can see it, David.
Okay. Well, tragedy of growth. Well, tragic makes for a dramatic caption. I found myself slightly uncomfortable with the term. I mean, if you lived in Malawi, for example, you might actually think a bit of growth would not be a bad thing. So I'm going to be a little bit presumptuous and hope that Positive Money will excuse me if I make a slight edit. I'm going to call it the tyranny of growth, because I think replacing tragedy with tyranny, or tyranny of GDP growth. Tyranny comes from the obsession, in my view, with politicians and the media using growth as measured by GDP as the absolute measure of the success or failure of the economy. Lack of growth is greeted with the shock horror headlines similar to those reporting increase in public death. Actually, I've got to just pull this over. My screen here is hiding my notes a wee bit. Yeah. So as far as they're concerned, growth is always good and can be used for a justification for any policy, even a good or essential policy in its own rights. So tackling crisis change could be promoted on the basis it will create growth. And I couldn't resist just here showing our
it's vital for all of us to show that this is not all about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging, or however you want to put it. I'm not even with bunny hugging, but you know what I'm driving at, friends and colleagues. This is about growth and jobs.
Well, okay. I mean, we'll go for the jobs bit. That is quite good, but again, it's got to be growth. Everything has got to be based on growth. So. But let's just have a look at growth, and we'll be a little bit kind to it to begin with. In his marvelous book, Sapiens, Yuval Harari writes, "It is not easy to grasp the true role of economics in modern history. Volumes have been written about how money founded states and ruined them, opened new horizons and enslaved millions, moved the wheels of industry and drove hundreds of species to extinction. Yet to understand modern economic history, you really need to understand a single word. The word is growth. For better or worse, in sickness and health, the modern economy has been growing like a hormone-soused teenager. It eats up everything it can find and puts on inches faster than you can count. So, okay. So he explains how the role of credit was a sort of transformation, basically brought on by science, which then, of course, produced on the sort of industrial revolution. And suddenly, so while credit had been there for a long time, suddenly some new reason for credit becoming important came on. And this was to do with optimism. Suddenly the future could be better than the past, which up until that period really wasn't true. Things all stayed the same. So he suggests here again, a little chart he had in his book. In the pre-modern economy, there was little trust in the future. So there was little credit, and so you got slow growth. And now, in particularly the earlier stages, you have much trust, much credit, and fast growth. And he explained how credit funded entrepreneurs, and that created was actually that credit, as Positive Money love to point out, was created out of thin air. But the great thing was that by creating credit, it got the economy moving. It allowed entrepreneurs the funds to do things. So there was a lot of benefit to it. But whilst tempting to liken creating credit out of thin air as a Ponzi scheme, he said, no, it's absolutely was the brilliance of human imagination. And so what enables banks and the economy to flourish is our trust in the future. And this trust is the sole backing for most of the money in the world, which has driven growth. Credit is the difference between today's pie and tomorrow's pie. Well, we have seen increases in the size of the pie over the last 500 years, but along with it, we've seen huge damage to our environment and huge inequality, both between and within societies. And it's interesting, I've just been reading John Maynard Keynes, amazing biography by Robert Sabelski, and he was convinced that as technically improved productivity, humankind could spend less time toiling and more time enjoying leisure, community, the arts, etc. So what did he get that wrong? Why was his forecast wrong? I suppose that brings us back to the difference between today's pie and tomorrow's pie, and the assumption that tomorrow's pie has always got to be bigger, but actually there might be nothing wrong with the smaller pie, ideal better quality. But anyway, what do we mean by a bigger pie? How do we specify what about? I mean, as Lucy mentioned, you could include happy life could be part of the pie, but we don't measure it. So what we're currently doing, we're using this thing GDP, and we all live by it. So let's look at that a wee bit. GDP, and you'll notice there in this slide, there are three. We're going to concentrate on GDP, but actually the original one was gross national income. And that was created by the request of Congress in America by Simon Kuznets in 1934. And it was used as a tool to help determine the depth of the Great Depression. And then during World War II, it was repurposed to help the Allies outproduce the Axis powers in weapons and armaments. But then it became an established method of reporting economic performance. And actually the US switched to the GDP in 1991. They were a bit later. Other countries picked up the same thing. I think it's worth just reflecting that even back in 1934, we saw the economy very much more as a sort of industrial thing. It was factories and investment and reinvestment. And clearly the economy has moved on to a very different economy today. But anyway, just as a note, that when Kuznets gave his proposals to Congress, he warned the welfare of a nation can't scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. And later, Robert Kennedy, he commented on gross national income. It measures everything except what makes life worthwhile. So what does it measure? Well, let's take a look at that. How is GDP calculated? Well, it actually can be calculated three ways. To complicate matters, there are three ways: total value, everyone's income, on what everyone in the country has spent. The last measure, total spending, is perhaps the most familiar and can simply be broken down as household spending, investment, and government spending, plus net exports. But I'm actually going to switch to the first one, which is the total value of goods and services output produced. And so what do we mean by value? Well, actually, there's nobody better to talk about the value, I think, in the current is the Mariana Mazzucato. And I'm going to quote from a review in Nature by Robert Constanza of her book, The Value of Everything, which I've read and I strongly recommend it. Early economists focused on production of value from land, that was Francis Quesnay and the physiocrats, later labor, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, and capital. In this view, value determined price. In other words, what went into something is what got its price. By contrast, the current mainstream marginalist concept bases value on market exchange, price as revealed by the interaction of supply and demand in markets. This determines values, and only things that have value are those that fetch a price. And strangely enough, I remember, it's one of the memories I have of childhood, my father, who was a lawyer, suddenly saying in a quite sort of pontifical way, the value of something is what somebody will pay for it. And I must say that that was obviously becoming topical at that time. And we're talking now 40 years ago, we're talking when economic thinking was beginning to change. And there was a point where suddenly value did become what somebody was willing to pay for something, not basically what it cost to make it. So this has major implications for ideas of the distinction between value creation and value extraction, the nature of unearned income, rent, and how value should be distributed. And as Mazzucato notes, it stokes inequality. Of course, the market, simply by generating income, is seen to justify its level and distribution. All income, according to this logic, is earned income. Gone is any analysis of activities in terms of whatever they are, productive or unproductive. And I think this is terribly important. These include how the financial sector's casino capitalism mislabels market speculation as the creation of value rather than the mere extraction of value created elsewhere, and how the real value added by government and public goods and services has been ignored to the determinants of us all. I can't risk including this quote from Matt Taibbi. I'm sure everybody knows it, but it is just a reminder. The first thing you need to know about Goldman Sachs is that it's everywhere. The world's most powerful investment bank is great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. Well, it's a bit over the top, but rather good. And I think, however, Thom suggests that even if we were to definancialize the economy, in other words, we would remove all the rent and get back to the very basics, it would still not be right because they'd still be based on this interest-bearing debt. And the only way you can get over that is to keep having growth. And so they really want to make some changes there. Just going back to GDP for a moment, whilst Goldman Sachs are doing God's work, and the City of London claims to be the most productive part of the UK, geographical GDP actually excludes quite a lot of things. Now let's just look what it excludes. For example, parents bringing up their children, they don't contribute to GDP. Elderly people, children caring for their elderly parents don't contribute to GDP. No voluntary service contributes to GDP. If you can't measure it, it's not really there by GDP. Actually, that's not quite true, as I'll show in a moment. But anyway, the other things that don't go in, there are no negatives. So if we have a natural disaster, so a Boeing airplane crashes into the ground, that doesn't a negative from GDP. A natural disaster doesn't subtract from GDP, but strangely enough, the recovery work after this will add to GDP. Supplying arms to Saudi is good for GDP, and better still if they keep killing Yemeni and having to buy more. Actually, just going back to, you can't be measured by money, it's not in GDP. How many people actually know that GDP includes, amazingly, all of us who own our houses, we are, you have an income for the rent that we would pay if we didn't own our house. So you know, GDP is very much a created thing. the one excuse I can give for GDP, of course, is that what they're really looking at isn't the absolute figure. What they're really looking for is a trend. Is GDP next month better than GDP this month? But when we look at what's going into GDP, if the City of London has a ball on some speculation or something and they make loads of fees and things, well, that's all great for GDP. So I think it's the financialization is really a problem. So before coming back and to Lucy to talk about what other methods we could use, I just want to refer to one or two books which I think are really good and worth people reading. Rentier Capitalism, Who Owns the Economy and Who Pays for It, is an absolutely stunning book by Brett Christophers, and I can strongly recommend it. Another book, which is rather an academic book, which is absolutely fascinating. This was written by Dan Ramarkovitz, and he's a professor of law at Yale, which probably turns out the top lawyers in America anyway. And he's describing the complete obsession all these people have now got at the top end of the consultancies and the lawyers and the financial people. They're all paying fortunes to get their children into the best schools, to having, I mean, the competitiveness is unbelievable. And they've all got to get to Harvard or Yale or whatever. And he said, more than that, they've actually now created an economy, which really only they can work out how to work with it. And it isn't, you know, there's just a rat race that's completely gone mad. So, and so this getting back to this rent and this, you know, we have to decentralize the economy. And now this isn't particularly on GDP, but it is another book which I read, which again I think does push towards the fair economy, and that's this book by Minouche Shafik, What We Owe Each Other. And again, I can strongly recommend it, A New Social Contract. She's actually the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, an amazing woman. She was born in Egypt, actually educated in US, England. She's been an amazing CV, and these ideas are very good, and I can strongly recommend it. Then the last book, which actually could even be a knock on the door to going to be delivered, this one completely shook me. I only just heard about it the other day. This was written, Limits to Growth. This was written, published in 1972. They sold 30 million copies, and it was actually a forecast. It was set up by the Institute of Rome, I think, Club of Rome, and it actually forecast the crisis we're now in. I mean, it basically said you can't go on expanding the economy, you can't go on doing, and so I couldn't resist having read about it, but I really thought I ought to get it. So yeah, I think growth, just to finish on that, I'll stop sharing and you can see my face as I speak. The whole question is that GDP is now all muddled up. It doesn't even measure the real things that matter in life. Financialization, and I really don't think, you know, we keep talking about this unfair community, unfair society we've got. Financialization and the whole debt it's absolutely ruinous, and it's going to have to be changed. So anyway, better ways to measure what we want in life, how to go forward, and I will stop there and see if Lucy can come up with, suggest what Positive Money are proposing. Okay.
Thanks a lot, David. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, alternative indicators of prosperity to GDP. Well, reading the report by Positive Money, they initially talk about these aggregate indicators, and whilst these are better than GDP, they are an improvement. There are still downsides to them. So where you have a sub-indicator that might have gone up and another sub-indicator might have decreased, your overall impression is that things are staying the same. So there's a basic problem with loss of information. And there's the Human Development Index is an example of one of these common aggregate indicators. And it's scoring things like life expectancy, schooling, and income. But I think, you know, one thing we're seeing quite quickly, just to go back to the earlier point, beyond basic human needs, the needs that we all have to enhance our well-being and to grow and prosper are so variable, because we are all very different individuals. So this has caused a lot of head scratching. I could sort of almost feel it as I was reading through. How on earth do we do this? The genuine progress indicator is another example of a common aggregate indicator, and it's expressed in monetary terms. Hurrah, yippee, because obviously that's what we're used to, is putting a monetary value on things. And it was interesting to hear David, it was interesting to hear you talk about your father and saying how the value of something is what someone's prepared to pay for it. Well, when you think back to your list of things that you all enjoy doing, and on the one hand, yes, there is what are you prepared to pay for your swim or your music concert or your participation in cycling or so on. But I think more importantly, how do you monetize the benefit you gain from it? And I think that's pretty key and probably impossible to really put a figure on. So going back to this genuine progress indicator, well, it's similar to GDP, excuse me, and it attempts to correct the blind spots by incorporating monetary values for some of the things that David referred to just now, the unpaid household labour, the environmental and social damage, income inequality, and so on. And interestingly, the genuine progress indicator and GDP, when you look at those on a graph, well, from the late 70s to the early 80s, or around that period, GDP continues to go up, whereas GPI is starting to decline. So that's quite an interesting phenomenon to pick up on. So what Positive Money is proposing is a dashboard of well-being indicators, and other economists who I've looked into include a Dutch economist called Nikki Powell. She gives quite an interesting talk, and she calls it a matrix. There's a table in the report by Positive Money called the Human Scale Development Approach, and it has 4 columns across the top: being, having, doing, and interacting. And then the rows are basically the a sort of an enhanced version of Maslow's needs. So as well as subsistence and protection, they talk about affection, understanding, participation, leisure, creation, identity, and freedom. So I think, you know, hats off to the economists, because this is all getting economics away from this idea that they once had of economics being, you know, like one of the pure sciences with laws. And we're getting into much more touchy-feely social sciences territory, which is bound to be difficult to represent, you know, numerically. So the important point that Positive Money do make about this dashboard is that however we go about it, that it should be grounded in this human scale development approach, which I've just described to you. And what I would say is that I really understand that there is this need for, you know, people in charge, governments, policymakers, to be able to monitor and analyse, you know, how their country's doing, how regions are doing, and communities. On the other hand, one question I would like to put to you all is, does all this measuring and monitoring, or to what extent does all this measuring and monitoring benefit the people whose well-being we're trying to enhance? Because unless the measuring and monitoring is leading to action, I would say that an awful lot of money and energy and resources are being spent on all these development of all these sort of concepts and theories and graphs and data collection. And meanwhile, you know, there are people who still can't feed their kids. There are people who are still suffering enormous problems of stress and anxiety and depression. So my big invitation to economists and policymakers would be, you know, let's see some action on the ground. Let's actually see it, some of these observations being, you know, leading to real effective action. Now, at this point, I'm going to hand back to David, because David is going to lead us into looking at the structural changes, if you like, that are needed to really embrace this shift in emphasis. And, you know, I get it. I think it's a bit like the first swim of the year. It's not comfortable. It's going to be challenging. And I think, you know, Positive Money are putting forward a few ideas around the money and finance for a post-growth economy. Over to you, David.
My audio, and once again I'll go to share screen. I will stick with that, share, and hopefully it should go straight off when I get into rehearse. There we go. Okay. Well, I'm going to stick much closer here to Positive Money's text, because I think it was the easiest way for me to do it. So, money and finance for a post-growth economy. Overcoming the monetary growth imperative inherent in capitalism will require transformative policies, involve new ways of creating and circulating money that do not depend on continuous interest-bearing debt by commercial banks. So this, of course, really goes back to everything that Positive Money started off being to. And I'm still, I freely admit, working out the interplay between the people who follow modern monetary theory and the banks and everything else. But what we know is that debt is simply, and I'm going to throw here a graph which we threw a long time ago at our last meeting. I mean, debt is, and private debt, of course, everybody keeps talking about government debt, but private debt, which just keeps going up, and as more people are in debt, it simply means that they're paying money to pay off the interest and everything else. And this is just funneling. I mean, you go back, there's a wonderful story, but the fact of the matter is the money is simply, money gets pumped into the economy, and I take the whether by the central government or whether by banks creating it, and it's actually simply transferring slowly but surely from the many to the few, and it's been going on. This is really where inequality is coming from. If you remember that earlier I was talking about the whole idea of capitalism, is that you spent the money, you have productivity, you put things, you've got profit, the profit was spent reinvesting, improving production, and you hope that by improving the profitability, you paid better wages, the workers could save a bit. Those savings actually were, if you like, recycled through the debt business into investing in more, blah, blah, blah. But that's long since changed. And this graph, which is actually rather a disappointing graph, I think, from the book, but this simply shows where money is actually going. This is where, and this little line here is, and I know that we've gone on about this before, but that's what's lent in mortgages. I mean, this ludicrous situation of property prices, which, I mean, everybody keeps saying it's because we don't have enough houses. Well, that may well be part of it. The truth of the matter is we've also got banks creating money like with no tomorrow to lend people, and instead of lending it to people wanting to start a business and do something creative, they're lending it against existing assets. And if you're going back to that book I referred to about rentier economics, I mean, more and more money is simply going against existing assets, and quantitative easing, of course, demonstrated this. So you've got what's going to mortgages here, you've got the financial sector here, you've got non-financial corporations here, but even that, remember, a great deal of the money can be borrowed, and actually all they're doing is borrowing it so they can buy back their shares. So even this is probably not getting recycled into proper investment into better things. And then you've got the much smaller things down here. So that's the problem. So here we go. Money and finance for the post-growth economy. And the key principle needed to guide monetary transformations is the fostering of balanced creditor-debtor relationships, stemming the excessive power of creditors and reducing pressure on debtors to continuously grow their incomes for the purpose of debt repayment. And they have this chart in the report. And it says, as illustrated, we categorize these policies according to three overarching functions. They would serve a post-growth economy. Access to public means of payment, that's here, okay? Access to credit, which is over here, an immediate redistribution of power. All of these would reduce dependence on interest-bearing debt and contribute to fostering balanced relationships between creditors and debtors. Categories 1 and 2, that's this one and this one, provide long-term measures that will take time to achieve this goal. And 3 provides options to more immediately reduce existing power imbalance. So we'll just go to that now. So they're proposing central bank digital currency and universal basic income. There's a lot of talk at the moment, of course, about central bank digital currencies. Sweden and China's already well underway. A lot of people. It is just worth remembering that cash is real sovereign money, and money in your bank account is technically just bank-created debt, and not. So the idea of actually being able to have sovereign money somewhere, if you're not going to have cash under your mattress, well, central bank digital currency is one. But perhaps more importantly, if anybody's followed Professor Steve, it would allow, and we're living in a day now where it's quite possible that money has to be paid to people. We've been through COVID, there's all sorts of things, and the whole question of QE and money creation, monetized. One way to get money into people very quickly would be if they all had an account with or connected to the central bank, so that the government could actually pay people directly. Universal basic income, well, that's of course quite a topic, a controversial subject. But again, in the paper, they refer to Frances Coppola's recommendations, which she covers in her book, People's Quantitative Easing. But there are, of course, the great debate is between that and a job guarantee. I think I find myself leaning towards the universal basic income, but I can see a lot of the arguments for job guarantee. So let's just go on. The conclusion is that they recommend that the Bank of England issues central bank digital currency in collaboration with the Treasury explore progressive options for its distribution in the form of universal basic income. This is pretty radical stuff, of course, but nevertheless, this is what Positive Money are proposing. Okay. Complementary local currencies. This is an interesting one. Well-designed complementary currencies in regional local levels could further guarantee access to money that specifically promotes local economy and activity and politically tied. And what they say here is that there were successful examples of this, particularly in the early 30s in part of Germany, Austria, and the United States. Complementary currencies saw great success in reinvigorating local economies ravaged by the Great Depression. And whilst they don't use the local economy, I mean, it is worth looking at the experiment that the city here in England, Preston, has been doing about really localizing its economy. So the problem with all those previous experiments with local currencies, the central banks didn't really like it very much, and so they actually all got shut down. So that would be difficult. Access to credit. Well, direct clearing facility, what they write is direct clearing facilities are particularly promising for a post-growth monetary system, as they're based entirely on balance and reciprocity between participants. They are essentially a simple accounting system that records debts and credits between firms when they trade with each other. The overall balance always comes to zero. Now, I must say, I struggled a bit to, and I really should have gone back to the writers of this to make sure I quite understand it. But it seems to me that what I did read, interestingly, was again in Keynes. This is what he was promoting at an international level with his International Clearing Union. You may remember, you may have heard the term Bancor. And that at that level, the international level, it's been increasingly recognized as a potential trade balances and economic justice from Varoufakis and Adler and people. But basically, as far as I can see, this would be like a local bank which doesn't give any, which doesn't, where the credits and the debits have to zero out. So for me, it seems that this is tied very closely to what they have to say about public banking, which is here. Small-scale public banking institutions grounded in local communities and owned by the members or local authorities have much to offer in the context of overcoming the monetary growth imperative. Community-level banking ensures that creditors develop strong personal and balanced relationship with the business they finance. But of course, you can look at Germany, where they have these much smaller local banks. And what Positive Money is saying is this would be moving away from the speculative originate and distribute model of banks, which rapidly package and sell loans and their associated credit risk. Private engineering need not be banned. They say that they don't object to private banks, though the alternative ways of accessing credit and liquidity outlined so far would likely minimize the demand for private bank credits. To the extent that commercial banks do retain a role in the economy, credit guidance can help ensure their lending is in line with social and environmental objectives. Well, it's all pretty dramatic stuff. The talk about local banks, I mean, I know it's been looked at. It was Professor Werner, I was trying to set it up, and I know there are some. I feel as an oldie myself that maybe younger people are so into the digital world that they will come up with solutions which oldies like me haven't even been able to think about. But I love the idea of localism, and I would take it much further, actually. So on access to credit, they're recommending the Bank of England Treasury collaborate further to institute the process of credit guidance and enable, via financial and regulatory demands, the creation and sustenance of an ecosystem of public banks. Well, that would be great if they can do it. But it's going to be quite an uphill battle, I think. Okay, the immediate redistribution of power. Modern debt jubilee. Well, you need to listen and read Professor Michael Hudson on the subject of debt and debt jubilee. Certainly in history, going back during thousands of years, there have been debt jubilees where the debts have been completely written off by the leaders. Rather more difficult in the present age. And it's become more urgent, I think, because of COVID and the whole question of the private debt. Both Stephen Keen and Coppola have suggested that central banks create money. Steve Keen was rather more careful. What he suggests is that the government should literally, the central bank should literally create money, and that should be used if anybody receives it. So they have to pay off any debts they have, any borrowing. But if they don't have any debts, they would be forced to invest it in companies who would have to use that money to pay down their debt. It's a fairly sort of convoluted system, but actually, one of the problems with the paying down of debt that Positive Money is still concerned about is, of course, if the government simply, the central bank, gives people lots of money to pay down their debt, the great beneficiaries are the creditors of the people the debt in the first place. So it's this sort of huge imbalance between the creditors and the debtors. And it seems to me that a debt jubilee needs to actually wipe out quite a lot of what creditors have. But there we go, that's another subject. Monetary financing, immediate redistribution. Well, government traditional debt management operations, financing, spending via borrowing from the bond markets, provides creditors with undue power over the public purse, restricting the ability to finance both. Well, this brings up the whole subject of bond vigilantes. And interestingly, I was reading a very good article by Edward Harrison, who writes for an American Economist, and he was pointing out in America that, there's a lot of talk at the moment about inflation, but actually 10-year treasuries, the yield is incredibly low, 1 point something percent. And this whole experience with QE and the government, the central banks creating money, seems to have thrown the whole question about bonds into an interesting debate. I freely admit that I don't fully get my head round yet about monetizing. And we know that, for example, that the government, people talk about the government debt having gone up over the COVID by, I don't know the figure, I'm pulling this one out of my head, it's probably not the right figure, but sort of 300 billion or whatever it is. But actually the Bank of England has created that amount of money anyway. The Bank of England is sitting on a huge amount of the government debt. And if you argue that the Bank of England is owned by the government, and you can look at Japan, where the national debt is absolutely vast. But it's virtually all owned by the Central Bank of Japan, and it doesn't seem to be doing, it hasn't done them much harm. It's just sort of sitting there. The one big difference between Japan and the UK, and it is certainly something that worries me, is that Japan continually runs a surplus with the rest of the world. So it's not in debt. I'm a bit worried that this country is, we are running a big debt. And it's a huge difference between owing debt to yourselves and owing debt to the outside world. But I'm slightly diverting onto a private hobby horse there. Okay, so we just go to the last slide. We recommend that the Bank of England Treasury engage in closer monetary fiscal coordination to further institutionalize the process of monetary financing. This basically is indeed the sort of, if you like, the central bank. There one used the term printing money. So we get that into the reform tax system. And reform tax system, despite money creation powers of many central banks, reform tax system should nonetheless be part of the post-growth money and finance system to minimize concentration of power. Well, since I sort of joined Positive Money, I then sort of found myself reading all about modern monetary theory, and I have a huge amount of, I think there's a huge amount that's right about it. And one of the things that's clear is that, the amount of money is pumped into the economy, and it's all absolutely fine while it's circulating, going round and round, but eventually it piles up somewhere. And we all know, for example, that through COVID, it is interesting that the government has borrowed, if you like, the Bank of England has given the money, but anyway. And a lot of private people have seen their private wealth increase significantly, because the money has to end up somewhere. You know, it gets spent, it has to end up somewhere. And the problem is that it keeps ending up in the places where it isn't actually needed. And so there has to be taxation. And I've always felt the modern monetary theory don't press taxation as much as they should. Anybody who follows Richard Murphy would know how keen he is on taxation. I'm sure that's right. So tax is absolutely, the need for reform tax is widely recognized by post-growth and other progressive accountants. And so what taxes could we have? Well, higher marginal taxes on the highest incomes is certainly one. Taxes on wealth, where you could certainly see Piketty is a great one for that. Financial transaction tax, well, that always seemed to me to be an absolutely obvious one, particularly when you look at high-speed trading, and you actually look at the amount of what length of a share is now held. It's a matter of days or hours or something, not anyway. And then there's land and property taxes. I mean, it's a huge, huge subject. What wasn't mentioned here is of course moving your money outside of the country. So I've always worried about the lack of capital regulations, but that's another subject. Okay, so just the concluding paragraph here is that once the money system and the wider economy has been restructured to overcome the growth imperatives of capitalism, we can safely and comprehensively turn to alternative policy paradigm, fully discards GDP as a measure of progress, as explored in the next chapter. Well, we swapped the chapters, so Lucy covered that prior to this. I was actually quite interested to see that they think we should have this financial reform before actually doing away with GDP. That surprised me a wee bit. Quite amusingly, my reading in bed this morning was I got an article from the Prospect magazine, which okay, it's been written by Duncan Weldon, who's a writer for The Economist, and he's just recently published a book, and he's rather implying that we're so rooted in the ways we've been doing things in our laissez-faire economy that it's going to be very difficult to change things. My guess is that because of climate change, that crisis is actually going to force things which we haven't yet seen coming to us. So those are the sort of reforms. I'm afraid I strongly recommend, because we've only really been a sort of flick over it in our own way, is that you actually go and have a look at the Positive Money website. And actually, if you go to positivemoney.org, you can click on resources. If you then go down the publications, and it lists them, and scoping growth dependency would take it. But if you like to, David, I can put the link straight into the comments, I think, and then I'll send that in a few minutes. Also on that, you can go and have a look. There was when they launched the paper in May, they had over 600. There was 600 at the beginning of the count, and I think it went up. And it was a very good debate on this. Fran Burt was in fine form. David Barnes, actually the author, he presented it. Professor Guy Standing, he put some pretty useful criticisms. Caroline Lucas, Clive Lucas Clive Lewis were very positive, and there even Lord Devon, who was on about all sorts of things. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. You're going to get my face for a minute, just a more full screen. One of just two things which interest me. One is the MMT idea of resources. It does seem to me that we keep forgetting to look at resources. I mean, we talk about, we can do things if we've got the manpower, and if we've got the education. The money is not what should be the problem. I do think there's a problem if we've got far too many people sitting in the City of London doing clever things and screaming off the money. We probably need to change that. But I think we really need to think more about just resources and how we allocate resources, and talk about, and this could all fit back into well-being. I mean, we ought to be able to do all that we need to do, work far shorter weeks, and have far more time for leisure and all of the things, and not idle leisure, creative leisure. I mean, since I've retired, I've been educating myself on reading all sorts of things which I didn't have time to do. And the other thing which I think, and we were talking about the local banking, I feel localism. I'm sure that we in sort of redoing, we need to move away from the sort of vast central power of the Treasury in London. We need to have more local involvement. We need people to be able to be involved locally. They need to be taught and educated about these things. I think, economics is in a move. I'm not convinced that the Economist writer is right, but I think the politicians and people are, we've got to, the dialogue with the people has got to be better, and to talk about these things. Anyway, I think I've talked enough, and thank you very much. What I will do, David, is I'll put those 2 links onto the chat, and anybody can copy and paste if they want. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'd like to leave some time for questions. Lucy, I don't know if you wanted to come back, but on anything, or should we go to questions now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think participation is one of the main contributing factors to high levels of well-being. So
yeah,
let's hear from the floor.
That would be great. So I can see that we've got 3 blue hands gone up already, which is great. So let's go to Marjorie first of all. Marjorie, what's your question?
Well, just an observation that in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I was contacted by the Office of National Statistics, who decided that my household was the one they wanted to look at. And I duly got a telephone call with a lady from the Office of National Statistics. And I thought, I don't know how long this is going to go on. After about 10 minutes, it had finished, because all she wanted to know about me was what I was working. And I said, no, I'd retired. How long ago had I retired? Well, it was some years ago. Oh, well, we're really not interested in you. And all they basically wanted was, it was a job survey as far as I could see. And if I'd been working or furloughed, I think she would have dug into sort of more statistics. But basically, being a retired person, the Office of National Statistics wasn't at all interested in me. So I thought that said a lot about whether they welcomed my lifestyle, my greenness, but just the fact I wasn't working, I've been written off.
Oh, well, we certainly haven't written you off, Marjorie. I'm sorry to hear, sorry to hear that.
I am participating and learning.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, let's go to Paul next. And Paul, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I do. I've got a number, in fact, but I will take them one at a time and take my chances in the queue, because that seems fairer than dumping them all at once.
Thanks.
The first one I wanted to raise is perhaps with Lucy. I imagine you're available, that there's a World Happiness Report, which is produced by the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a snappy title, and it covers the objective, if not the detail, of the sort of measures which you were referring to.
Yeah.
Obviously, it has the advantage, A, that it's there, and B, that it provides comparatives with other countries, for example. To what extent are you expecting to leverage off that, or is it not helpful?
Well, I think it's certainly interesting to have a look at, and there is a graph that comes to mind. If I was more technically adept, like David is, David Moon, I would have screen shared just a few slides. But it's interesting. There's a graph that shows sort of levels of life satisfaction or happiness on one axis, with GDP on another. And it is interesting to see that there are plenty of examples of countries where GDP is quite low, and yet levels of happiness are quite high. And certainly I would be interested in going and finding out what is it about the culture that in those countries, and how, you know, what is life like there, that they manage to achieve high levels of satisfaction on a relatively low budget, if you like. So I think in broad brush terms, reports like that are useful. I think it's interesting to hear the previous lady, you know, make the comment about the ONS. You know, there's the ONS phoning somebody up, and I wonder how much that phone call contributed to her well-being. It struck me that it probably didn't, had the opposite effect. So I'm a little bit skeptical about all these. There is a tremendous number of reports out there and studies, and I'm just a little bit like, I think we know enough theory. I think we need to really just commit to taking some actions in reality. Yeah, does that answer your point?
Thanks, Lucy.
Yeah, yes,
Well,
I'll leave it, thanks.
Yeah, Paul, we'll come back to you a little bit later if we've got some time, but
Absolutely.
yeah, that's great. Thanks, Paul. Okay, let's go to Steve next. Steve in Flirt.
Hi. Okay, I just wanted, I mean, the very interesting, and the economics obviously quite complicated, but I just wanted to mention something Lucy was saying. Originally you mentioned sort of Maslow and his hierarchies of needs and whatever, and obviously people need to get sort of certain levels of security and primary needs sort of satisfied before they can even begin to climb a sort of pyramid of and sort of 20 years ago people were talking a lot about that type of thing, you know, about sort of self-actualization and personal fulfillment. But it seems to me in this country for ever since then, mental health in this country has really moved away from that sort of thing, and they've been really trying to, you know, sort of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been seen as this kind of holy grail of everything, but it seems to put all the emphasis on the individual, telling them that their thinking is wrong and they need to change their thinking, and not look at the social conditions or the material conditions of their life. And CBT was seen to be such a great thing years ago, but nowadays it's heavily criticized. People sort of come back time and time again. They have like a few months of CBT, they're all right for a while, and then their life starts to collapse again, and then they're back for more therapy. And it seems to be like a revolving door therapy. I mean, would you still think yourself that we should probably go back to a sort of a more of a humanistic kind of approach to psychology?
Although I'm a mediator and a conflict coach, I'm not a psychologist. However, I think you're making a really interesting point there. In what I heard you say, there is a sort of tendency in approaches like that to sort of blame the individual almost, which then takes the focus away from the sort of endemic structural inadequacies of society, which, you know, are causing a lot of the stresses in the first place. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see. What I am hearing at the moment is a new what's the word, honesty, authenticity around mental health, which I think is really important and very refreshing. And I think that will definitely help to sort of raise awareness about it. And there's nothing like sharing what one's going through with an empathic listening ear, or to an empathic listening ear, to even just feel better. Which I must say, you know, I mean, thanks, we've got to this technology, we're together today, but it's not the same as all being, you know, at the Green Hotel or in a venue. So and I think mental health has been hit quite hard because of the COVID measures. So yeah, an interesting point, and it'll be good to see with economics picking up the baton around well-being, hopefully we will finally start seeing some real action.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Let's go to Everard next. Everard, what's your comment or question?
Can you see me, hear me?
Yep, we
Okay.
can.
Because I can't. But anyway, in about 1970, after school, in our afternoon engineering, last all afternoon engineering, and sort of towards the end of the period, the teacher would quite often shut down the machines and talk to us about broader issues. Boring, boring, boring. One thing I recall particularly in retrospect was that he said we were the first generation in history that would never have to suffer a 5-day working week because of the automation of the means of production. And young men would compete for the attentions of young women in the fields of sport, science, art, and literature. I can't remember that's his exact words. It was a kind of a bit of a, it was a sort of a quote from the Times. I don't know whether he was quoting somebody. Anyway, had I looked round at my fellow school people, this was in CSE engineering, so it was all boys, I would have realised it was a non-starter. As it happened, I said, yeah, well, that's obvious. I know this. This was in 1970. Most people, sadly, unlike most people here, don't have the ability or the interest in that sort of thing. A little later on, what I'll do is I'll put a link to a guy, my webpage about a guy, just quotes from this chap called H.P. Lovecraft, an American writer in the 1930s in the Great Depression, who was basically saying the same thing. I think that there is not enough work now to go around because of the automation of the means of production. That's in the 1930s. That's all.
Thank you, Everard. David or Lucy, I don't know if you want to comment on it. It sounded a little bit like Keynes's predictions all those years ago that we would have a wonderful utopia of leisure and a little bit of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the interesting point is saying that looking around, there weren't people who, I mean, clearly, in the ideal society, education, education would include making people much more capable of broadening their interests outside of work, you know. But no, I mean, move the clock to, well, if we move the clock 100 years forwards, you know, where are we going to be? I mean, maybe we won't be here at all, but it does seem to me that we have this ridiculous talk about automation doing away with jobs. And then terrifying, we're needing to up the retirement age because we're going to be short of people. I mean, it's complete. A lot of it doesn't really make very much sense when you look at what we ought to be, what the resources we've got, what we ought to be able to do, what we all want, and the amount of waste that we're all doing. We're all buying things and throwing them away, and you know, well, I could go on. But anyway, yeah.
Thanks, David. Lucy, I don't know if you wanted to say, but we could go on to the next question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, next question. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to, thanks for that, Everard. Let's go to Steve Lawton. Steve. You just need to unmute yourself, Steve. Should we come back to you? Okay, we'll come back to you. Let's go to Richard then. Richard, and you need to unmute yourself. Richard.
Hi. I had a question because I think David mentioned forgiving debt. And I think this is specifically a hot topic in America with regard to student debt. And I mean, I think the
your arm down. Good, I don't want my arm back.
Sorry. And the question I had was, is this a one-time solution? And if not, wouldn't this create a moral hazard in the sense that you could just take out debt and have the government forgive it periodically? Thank you.
David or Lucy, I don't know if you want to talk about, yeah, moral hazard. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think what I would argue is probably is that you shouldn't forgive student debt every now and again. That's probably a big mistake. I mean, there's a strong case, there's a progressive case that says you just shouldn't have student debt in the first place. That actually students shouldn't be paying shouldn't be going into debt to have their education. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. If you set something up where you say, well, then you've got the problem of what do you do when you forgive it? And do you forgive it to the people who've already paid it all back? I mean, there's a very strong case that actually they should just wipe out with America. That, I mean, Michael Hudson and people, I mean, it should be written down. I mean, the American debt is quite ludicrous, and they know it's not going to get paid anyway, and make a large amount of it. But I would argue, don't create the debt in the first place in that instance. Yeah, there's a huge moral hazard.
Yeah, sorry. So I was just using that as an example, but I mean, is the argument then for all debt that applies to, or is it student debt is in a separate bucket from other debt?
Well, the case that Positive Money is making, and indeed the case that people like Steve Keen and Michael and Michael Hudson are making, is absolutely, we are completely strangled now by debt, particularly private debt, and it needs to be got rid of. And yeah, it's a huge problem, and you get into the debate about monetization. I remember Lord Adair Turner, at the very beginning of the beginning of the financial crisis, even he was talking about, actually monetizing some of the debt. Shock horror, we should only do it once. But I think this business of, money, how money is created and where it's created and how it's spent, I mean, I'm out of my depth, I'll be honest with you, but I'm trying to understand it. But yeah.
I've got a little point, actually, if I may. So with regard to what I'm hearing in your question is moral hazard, as if to say, if people think that they can just get into debt, and then the debt will be written off at some point, is that just going to make for people going on, ridiculous spending sprees? Well, I mean, one thing I would say is that I think we're living in a time where we're much more aware of our planetary boundaries. So the idea, there was a brilliant project called The Story of Stuff, and David just mentioned this business about waste. I think a greater level of awareness about that will, for many of us anyway, I know you'll always get some who will be reckless. That's, we're all different and there's diversity and all the rest of it. But I think more people than we probably realise do care about the planet, are mindful of our responsibility to future generations. And actually, the more you own, the more there is to look after. And life gets more complicated. Once you've got a lifestyle that suits your sort of your well-being, which will vary for all of us, and thank God, because otherwise I think the world would be very boring. So I'm not sure that moral hazard is as big as you are concerned that you might think it is. I hope that helps.
I want to come back just momentarily on the moral hazard, because it's one of the things which we tend to forget. The moral hazard should be on both sides of the deal. If a bank lends money to somebody when they know perfectly well it's high risk, then they've created a moral hazard. And at the moment, the whole relationship between debtors and creditors is far too heavily weighed in part of the creditors. I mean, if one goes back, go back to America and the housing crisis. Dear old Obama, he bailed out the people who had lent the money, but he didn't bail out the people who were saddled with the debt. I mean, it was complete, you know, so moral hazard is on both sides. The creditors has got much involvement, and we don't allow for that. Okay.
Thanks, David. Okay, I can see Steve Lawton is dying to get in there. So Steve, let's go to you. And Steve, you studied under Steve Keen as well, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yeah. Can I first say, Lucy and David, I thought the talk was brilliant, and I really liked it. And what I wanted to say was it highlights a sort of certain contradiction, that on the one hand, we've got people who haven't got enough GDP, we've got in-work poverty, and on the other hand, we've got loads of wealth lying around being hoarded and not being spent. And David mentioned, what's his name, Richard Werner, who lived and worked in Japan for some time, and he's created a film and written a book called Princes of the Yen, in which he describes how the relative equality and the economic miracle of Japan after the Second World War was made possible by credit guidance, which again is what David mentioned. The credit guidance means that you don't allow the banks to lend for the purchase of existing assets. You don't allow them to go on lending for the purchase of property. The banks lend to businesses in order for them to invest in the production of goods and services. And I think Positive Money's slides, or what that David just put up, mentioned credit guidance. If you have credit guidance, as Japan had it after the Second World War, until America dismantled it, they dismantled credit guidance in Japan under America's instruction because America was fearful that the Japanese economy was outdoing their own. That's how that happened, according to Werner. If you go back to credit guidance, and as I think German banks had it after the Second World War as well, then you stop this question of moral hazard. And my point that I was leaping to make was David's just made for me. There's two sides to moral hazard, and David just made that point. We're bailing out lenders who knew that they were that the borrowers wouldn't be able to repay. And we're all having to bail them out, and that's well known. Anyway, yeah, great talk. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much, Steve. If I may, David and Lucy, I'd like to just try and squeeze in a few more questions as we're getting a little bit short of time. So if we could go to David Nunn. David, what's your comment?
Thank you, David. Again, very interesting talk. Thank you. 2 points, really. The first point is separate to this talk, another talk, which I can't remember the name of, I do apologise, but they seem to suggest that income taxes don't actually go towards funding government expenditure. And I just could not get my head around that at all. That I thought, well, it's an income to the government, surely it must contribute. And they were arguing, no, it doesn't contribute. The second thing is a way of, by the way, it's a way of controlling spending and things like that. But my second point was about the United States, because if I'm not mistaken, they've got a habit of giving just financial lump sums to individuals, like $5,000 to each, and to spend in the economy, because they're called quantitative easing, went to the banks and just bailed out the banks. It didn't increase public spending or productivity. But the Americans seem to. Why don't the British do that? That's really my question. Why don't the British adopt the same thing as the Americans by just giving us loads of money? That would be fantastic, so we can spend it. Over.
Well,
okay, thanks, David. Yeah, if you could pick up on one of those, or both of them quickly, David. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, and then Steve Lawton would probably be better at answering this one, but if you look at monetary theory, which I strongly recommend you do look at, what it says is that money, the government can spend money. We've seen that. We've just seen the Bank of England create 300 billion to help, so the government doesn't actually need your taxes to spend. It can create the money and spend it. But of course, that if all that money stays in the economy, then you'll get inflation, because everybody was sitting on all this money piling up. So you've got to pull that money back. And so the theory there is that you're not taxing to spend, you're taxing to remove the money from the economy that you've already put into the economy. In other words, it's a reverse action. And I I didn't understand that when I first joined positive money, but I think the modern monetary theory and quantitative easing and the modern has actually demonstrated that. As far as the second part of your question is, well, I mean, it could well be the case that they are going to have to do some better. I mean, this idea of people being thrown out of their houses now, landlords can give them notice for them. I mean, there's all sorts of problems, and that was why positive money are suggesting that there should be a method for the government to pay money very quickly to individuals, and that was the idea of a possibly, central bank digital currency and things. I mean, yeah, these things could come. I mean, we're in a changing world. I think, we are in a changing world.
I think along with the changes that we've talked about, one of the ways I would like to see taxing or taxes being used is to literally, let's tax those products and activities which, if you like, tax the environment or tax people. In other words, undermine well-being. And those products and activities that are contributing positively to well-being should not have to be taxed, or even could be subsidized, which is a bit what we're talking about here. So I think a sort of well-being focused tax system, or a system which taxes in particular those things. I mean, we saw it with cigarettes. That did have an impact on stopping people smoking. And I mean, if you're a smoker, you would have hated all that. And I get it, but basically, I think taxes could be used much more creatively, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy. Let's go to Kathy. And Kathy, I just want to thank you for suggesting this talk in the first place. So well done. But Kathy Silman, do you need to just unmute your screen if you can, so that we can hear you? That's it.
I think I need to listen to it again to, well, even half understand it. I struggle, that's why I wanted to talk. I'm just interested to know whether there's a movement to have a set like indicator like GDP to measure the well-being economy, so we can then look at countries worldwide. And I thought if that was going to replace GDP, it could influence how people and capital felt about the world. I'm not sure if there's a movement for that.
Well, yeah, very much so. And I can't remember the name of one of your members who mentioned the report by the UN. I know that the thing is, there have been quite a plethora, so many different proposals for different indicators and different systems that it's actually all a bit confusing in a way, or overwhelming, I should say. But definitely, I think they will come out with a preferred system and start using it to draw comparisons. And then, I mean, anybody who's doing something that you want to do and they're doing it really well, it's pretty obvious that you go and ask them what their secrets are, don't you? You go, how are you managing to achieve what you're achieving? So I think that would be great to see a lot more of that going on as well.
But do you think it's actually likely in the next 5 years?
I think it's only likely if we can deal with this addiction to growth. We have to stop. I think we have to stop being scared of critiquing capitalism as we know it. If that means talking about different versions of capitalism, let's do that. If that's easier for people, if economists and business people are more comfortable, financiers. But I think that's the only thing we can do if we want to improve well-being. We'll find that a lot of the things that contribute to positive well-being, perhaps they're not great money makers. but they indirectly, you could say they are. If you have some sort of way of monetizing the benefit of an activity for individuals' well-being and for planetary well-being. But I think that's what's difficult. Very difficult to put a real monetary value on the benefit you gain from your walk in the forest.
We need a global mind change. Things do change, don't they?
I think we just need some natural common sense, actually. But
well, I agree with you.
Okay, thanks,
I think
Kathy. David, sorry, I'm just going to. We're very short of time now.
Yep.
3 more people are waiting to ask a question. I'm just going to have to ask people to be very brief now. Perhaps we'll take all 3 in one go, and then we'll have some concluding comments, if that's all right. So the 3 people still waiting, and I can't allow any more after the 3. Paul Entwistle, Steve, and Chris. So let's go to Paul. A second bite of the cherry, Paul.
Okay, I'll try and keep mine short. I think the main, first of all, I should say I'm entirely with your objectives, and thank you very much for the talk. My concerns are more around means. You spoke about weaning ourselves off laissez-faire capitalism. My question is around how do we change behaviours, because just asking people to change behaviours is a complete waste of time. And for example, we have extraordinarily lax corporation tax law, corporation laws in this country. So I'll stop there in view of the time.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I'm going to take the other questions, and then I'll ask Lucy and David to comment in a sort of wrap up at the end. Steve, we're getting a little bit of background noise, but what's your question?
Okay, if you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, it's just picking up on actually behaviours and moral hazard, and something David was saying about there's a lot of people potentially facing eviction, maybe up to 1 million people because they've got rent problems. I mean, the government warned about this years ago when they went to the over to the universal credit system, where they were before landlords were paid their rents directly from a council, but now, of course, people on universal credit gets their rents paid directly to them, and then it's their responsibility to pay it on to the landlords. But there's a moral hazard in that some of these vulnerable people haven't passed that rent on, and of course they've got themselves into trouble. Whereas they wouldn't have got themselves into trouble before. So again, echoing what Paul was just saying about behaviours, there's lots of problems with the way government or people set things up, and then of course the unintended consequences that affect a lot of vulnerable people, for instance, who are probably going to find themselves evicted now. So
okay, thank you, Steve. And let's go finally to Chris Gribble. Chris, what's your comment on this?
Hi, thanks. Wonderful talk. It's an observation more than a question, but in terms of considering well-being, we talk about, the impact of growth. And I guess when one considers the environmental constraints that we have, the impact on the planet of this growth, in biological systems, uncontrolled growth is called usually termed a cancer. And I guess the observation I have is that what seems to have changed in my limited lifespan is that we've kind of gone to consumption as an indication of well-being, kind of under controlled consumption or retail therapy, which has such a powerful impact on the economics. And when one considers well-being, it's, I wonder where we're placing things that are non-materialistic in terms of the rewards that one gets, and the challenge to the economy that we have in actually downgrading that consumption, because clearly, we're a bunch of locusts consuming the world's resources, and we can all see where it's going to end up. In addition to the sheer numbers of people that we have on the planet, and I just really wanted to get a comment from Lucy in where is that kind of consideration in the fact that we all want to consume, and how do we address that in encouraging well-being without necessarily facilitating that consumption, fueling kind of what I see as a cancerous growth.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you. Yeah, well, in a way, I see a link between all 3 points. Interestingly, when you look up the dictionary definition of economy, on the one hand, it's the state of a country or region in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services and the supply of money, or it's the careful management of available resources. So I think that we've all become consumers is because the definition that's been highlighted and we've been, in a way, encouraged or even forced, you might say, to take is the first one, and this whole emphasis on consumption and production. And I think one area I would like to look at some point in all this is the advertising industry, and the fact that, you know, we only think we're lacking something when we're told, you know, lots of people are told you should buy this, you need the next that, and people are bombarded. I think it's something like the average American is something like 3,000, you know, advertising hits a day. So that's one thing. The other thing to do with changing behaviours, well, I think this is where, you know, let's look at how we incentivize people. And the idea of credit guidance and perhaps, you know, perhaps some kind of vouchers as well. So, you know, if you're giving people helicopter money, don't just give them money, give them a certain amount of that, vouchers, which can only be used to buy, you know, your basic foodstuffs, so that it can't just be used, you know, in the local betting shop or to buy alcohol and so on. I think, you know, we can look back at systems that did work, and then together with the technology that we have today, you know, it ought to be achievable, that there's enough guidance, and then we just have to be very careful not to, in my opinion, not to start impinging on freedoms. And one thing I'm wary of is that we look at China and we start following China a little bit too much, frankly. I think a central current, you know, digital currency is great, and that sort of direct access to nationalized bank is fine, as long as it doesn't start being used as a way of saying, oh, well, you know, you went on the latest protest against this, or, you know, basically controlling people too much. So that's an interesting one about behaviours. I think incentives is the best.
Thanks, Lucy. David, do you have some concluding comments?
Well, I'll just sort of pick up on Chris's point. I mean, he's absolutely right. Consumption, the problem is my consumption is your job. If I stop buying your things, you don't have a job. And so if you think of yourself as the great dictator, how would you wind down? Now, admittedly, at the moment, the problem with our consumption is virtually all coming from Amazon, from China. Clearly, that's a problem. But assuming we had a totally enclosed economy, and what we said, well, we need to consume less, but there would have to be some centralized way of evening down, if you like, the reduction of consumption. You can't just, you know, otherwise people are going to lose their jobs. So it's this huge problem, is that my consumption is your job, and your business has got to do everything possible to keep going. It's got to grow. It's so that it has to employ advertisers to persuade people to buy its products that they don't really need. And we have this ridiculous spiral. This is sort of, if you like, the disaster of growth. But how you unravel it is really the big question. And there's loads more to talk about. I think that's enough from me.
Okay, well, look, I can see, David, that there are loads of questions as well as answers. But Lucy and David, you've given us a tremendously stimulating afternoon. Thank you so much, and lots of book suggestions as well. I think I'm going to go ahead and read the Positive Money report. That looks very, very interesting. And as I say, this is being recorded. You'll be able to, Kathy will be able to watch it again on YouTube, and anyone else who wants to. I'll put a report in the next bulletin as well, just to try and pull out some of the key points. Fantastic. Thank you so much for all the work you put into it, Lucy and David, and we hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much, David.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.